Well, thanks for that introduction. And first of all, it's an honor for me to speak on the topic of anti-Asian hate and the Asian American dilemma. And I'll explain what I mean by. I think anti-Asian hate we all understand, but the Asian American dilemma will require a little bit more um, explanation, and I'll do that shortly in my presentation. And I will aim for about 25-30 minutes for this, and then we'll do questions. And you're always welcome to interrupt me if you have a question clarifying something or whatnot. But a word of appreciation first. Thank you to my dear friend Veronica K. Phillips for thinking of me and inviting me to speak today, to Department Chair Silvestri, Dr. Silvestri, and everyone here on Zoom for spending their time with me today. The Emory University School of Medicine, Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine. To give you a sense of the things I'd like to go over today in my presentation on anti-Asian hate and the Asian American dilemma, I want to set some of the historical context of anti-Asian hate, talk about the political context of anti-Asian hate, and explain to you this Asian American dilemma to understand better the position of Asian Americans in society, and then talk a bit about the violence and the anti-Asian hate incidents and crimes that have taken place recently, and then conclude with some thoughts. So let me launch right in. The idea of setting this historical context of anti-Asian hate. If you look back at history, one of the first cases to take place involving Asians in the United States was the People versus Hall. Basically, it was a case where, to set the context, Chinese immigrants had already begun coming to the United States in significant numbers in the 1850s, largely to California and other Western states, to work in mining and railroad construction. And there was a high demand for these dangerous low-wage jobs. So Chinese immigrants were willing to fill them. Almost immediately, the racist trope of Asians coming to steal white jobs was born. And in 1854, the California Supreme Court reinforced racism against Asian immigrants in the case of People versus Hall, ruling that people of Asian descent could not testify against a white person in court. And that had happened with African Americans before. So now it was happening to Asians by saying that this would, and the effect of this was to virtually guarantee that whites could escape punishment for anti-Asian violence, since Asians could not testify in court against a white person. And the case was over a murder. George Hall had shot and killed a Chinese immigrant named Ling Sing, and the testimony of witnesses was rejected because they were also Asian. So that history really plagues us. And when I talk about the jobs that Chinese immigrants to the United States did, we of course know that the railroads were largely built on Chinese labor. And this famous picture, this iconic photograph of the Golden Spike, records the celebration marking the completion of the first transcontinental railroad lines at Promontory Summit, Utah on May 10th, 1869, when Leland Stanford of Stanford University, co-founder of the Central Pacific Railroad, connected the eastern and western sections of the railroad with a golden spike. If you look at the picture carefully, there aren't any Chinese in there. They've simply been erased by not being allowed to be in this picture. So that is really part of that history of erasure. There are pictures, of course, of Chinese working in the railroads, and these are the Chinese laborers during the railroad's construction. There are more photos of this at Stanford University's Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project website, if you want to look them up. The next, I think, important event is the Chinese Exclusion Act that was a United States federal law signed by President Chester Arthur on May 6, 1882. This prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers and and essentially built on an earlier act called the Page Act of 1875 that banned Chinese women from immigrating to the United States. So prior to 1882, Chinese men could come as laborers, but between 1875 and 1882, women were not allowed. So they couldn't obviously have families, they couldn't have kids, and so they couldn't settle as a result. But as of May 6, 1882, men also could not come. Chinese men also could not come, and so this is really an example of the Chinese Exclusion Act as the only law really to have been implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. We've seen, of course, bans of Muslims enacted in the last presidential administration. That, I think, was a kind of inspired by this idea that you could exclude certain people, but it had been thought until then that such exclusion really was unconstitutional. Here a cartoon from that time, the Chinese wall, quote unquote, around the United States of America, and really more of these cartoons here. I think from somebody who didn't like Chinese exclusion. It says, notice communists, nihilists, socialists, Fenians, and hoodlums welcome, but no admittance to Chinaman. And it really was, I think, a moment in American history that showed just how far the law could be used to exclude an entire ethnic group or people of a certain national origin. But we see that happening again during World War II, when the Western Defense Command and Fourth Army Wartime Civil Control Administration, for example, in this poster says that as of May 3rd, 1942, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the following area, listed there, to be interned into internment camps. So the internment camps and the internment of Japanese Americans in the United States during World War II was the forced relocation and incarceration in concentration camps in the western interior of the country of about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of whom lived on the Pacific coast, approximately 2/3 of whom were US citizens. These actions were ordered by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt shortly after Imperial Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. So again, legally speaking, dubious exercise of authority in keeping people in behind barbed wires in essentially in camps. And we've again seen precedents repeated in the sense of keeping children in detention, separated from their mothers, for example. Killings and mass shootings in 1871, 1982, 1989, 2021. I've skipped over a bunch of other killings and mass shootings, but I wanted to emphasize essentially the history and the trajectory of this. So the Chinese massacre of 1871, for example, was one that happened October 24th, following the murder of a white man caught in the crossfire between rival Chinese groups. More than 500 white and Hispanic rioters surrounded and attacked Los Angeles' small Chinese community centered in the red light district. And at least 17 Chinese men and boys were lynched, including a prominent local doctor. They were hanged across several downtown sites, anywhere the rioters could find a beam to string a noose. 8 of the rioters were eventually convicted of manslaughter, but their convictions were overturned. No one else was ever punished. And there were subsequent massacres and killings of that nature, but I'll skip to 1982 and the killing of Vincent Chin, one individual who I think some of you may have been familiar with. He was a Chinese American draftsman who was beaten to death in a racially motivated attack by 2 white men, Chrysler plant supervisor Ronald Evans and his stepson, laid off auto worker Michael Nitz. The 2 of them assailed Chin following a brawl, and he'd just come out of Chin had just come out of his bachelor party with friends in advance of his upcoming wedding. They apparently assumed that Chin was a was of Japanese descent and are alleged to have used several racial slurs as they attacked him. Both of them blamed Chin for the success of Japan's auto industry, and this was the case despite the fact that Chin was actually of Chinese descent. But that's really, you know, part of that history of anti-Asian hate. And in 1989 in Stockton, and this is something that I feel is near and dear to me, because, you know, this is a white man, a deranged white man, aimed his bullets at Asians, and this took place at the Cleveland School in Stockton, California. Essentially, this individual, this gunman, invaded the schoolyard and killed 5 children and injured 30 others before killing himself. It was seen as a sort of a mass shooting situation, untargeted, but in fact, looking more closely at the evidence, the truth is that the gunman actually had already stated certain things. He was believed to have essentially targeted the school because of a large Cambodian and Vietnamese student body. And that at one of the last things the killer Purdy told the bystander was, the damn Hindus and boat people own everything. And the reference to boat people, obviously the Vietnamese who had fled Vietnam, fled typically by boat. And so that's the reference to boat people. And this is one of the funerals for some of the Cambodian kids that were killed. We jump now, of course, to 2021 with the attacks in Atlanta. 8 people were killed, 6 of whom were Asian women and 1 other person. The officer spokesperson who said the Atlanta spa shooter was having a, quote, bad day, himself promoted racist COVID-19 shirts on Facebook. I went looking for exactly that post. Love my shirt, he says, get yours while they last. It's a COVID-19 themed Corona beer looking font saying imported virus from China, spelled CHY-NA. Obviously a sad day, but for Asian Americans, here in this sign says, we have bad days too, but you don't see us killing white people. Let me move now to setting some of the political context of anti-Asian hate, and we've seen that over the last 4 years in the previous administration. A speech by President Donald Trump here, I think it's in the White House press room, in which he has crossed out Corona and replaced it with Chinese to underscore, obviously, the origins of the virus. Later, he uses the word Kung Flu and says, he can't claim that Kung Flu doesn't affect Asian Americans in this climate. But it's incredible that language, words have consequences, and the use of Chinese virus, China virus, Kung Flu will give people an idea that the origins of this are somehow in Asian Americans, even if they had nothing to do with it and have lived here for generations. What's more disturbing is that, you know, in this survey, do you think it is appropriate or inappropriate to refer to COVID-19 by names such as China virus and Kung Flu? 66% find it inappropriate. That's at least heartwarming that 66% find it inappropriate, but that 34% actually think it's somehow okay to use language like this. Obviously, Asian is not a virus. That ought to have been made clearer in this context. Now, let me talk a bit about understanding the Asian American dilemma. And it is one that I think makes it clear as to why it's so difficult for Asian Americans in America. They need to essentially break the perpetual foreigner stereotype. Being Asian American means living in a country that treats you as a perpetual foreigner. That has to change. And the pictures here, you know, say you're not really Asian, and in another, no, where are you really from? And I get those questions. It's one can let them roll by, or actually say, I'm not actually an American citizen. And my kids who were born in the United States, I don't want them to say, where are you actually from? They should say they're born in Monterey, California, and Los Angeles, California. This involves something called the model minority myth. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with this model minority myth, but it is a racial wedge that essentially pits one minority against another. So if you have a model minority, then you have the anti-model minority. You must have a minority group that doesn't fit, that isn't the model minority, that somehow is the poorly performing minority. And the dilemma here is really encapsulated in this quote, which says, on the whole, Asian Americans are wedged in the uncomfortable position as white adjacent on the one hand, and people of color on the other, and the complex set of stereotypes has rendered them invisible in discussions of race and prejudice in America. From a report by ASCEND, which is an Asian American leadership, Pan-Asian American leadership organization for corporate work. I went looking for what that can mean in terms of potential conversations, and I don't know whether this is a real conversation, but I'm Asian. Oh, you're Asian. I thought you were Filipino. Are you like both? Can you speak Asian? Make me a fortune cookie and rice. Do you do nails? You're just like my other friend. She's Asian. There's a lot of stereotypes around Asians, and you've got the level one. This is a bit humorous, but the level one novice, level two intermediate, and level three expert. From kung fu ninja warrior, geisha dragon blossom sex lady to nerd boy, and then level two tourist tiger mom kawaii, level three expert level businessman on benders, Jesus freak, or banana, yellow on the outside, white on the inside. But all of that has consequences, and these are stereotypes that affect people. I mean, even Andrew Yang, who ran for the Democratic nomination, made this statement while in a debate about, oh, he knows a lot of doctors, and I think that plays on this very, very difficult stereotype that that Asians are doctors, smart, unathletic, lawyers, docile, passive, exotic, infantile, nerd, thrifty, diligent, bad drivers, cheap, foreign, academic, good at math and science, A+ student, hardworking, not real, quiet, ambitious, weak, or have an accent. And the truth is that Asian Americans have a lot of issues, and in the Southeast Asian American community, for example, 35 to 40% of Hmong, Laotians, and Cambodians have not finished high school. And so if one thinks that this is a model minority of whom 35 to 40% haven't finished high school, that can't be, that this is irreconcilable. There's also the fact that APIs, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, account for over 50% of chronic hepatitis B infections in the United States, or that 32% in 2008, 32% of Korean Americans and 25% of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders did not have health insurance. And it goes on in terms of drops in household wealth, for example, from 2005 to 2009, after the last Great Recession, 54% drop there, and the largest percentage of foreclosures, along with the highest share of long-term unemployment, and so the list goes on and on. It's certainly a population that's growing very quickly, from 2000 to 2010. 46% growth, faster than any other racial group in the country, and 4 times faster than the total US population. But we still think of oftentimes, those Asian American whiz kids, a cover from Time magazine, or certainly before COVID-19, it was the model minority, but after COVID-19, it's the Chinese virus. The violence and anti-Asian hate incidents and crimes, and I should say incidents obviously are different from crimes. Crimes involve something that was a victim that has suffered, and incidents are less severe in terms of impact. But 8 in 10 Asian Americans say violence against them in the US is increasing. And that nearly half have experienced an incident tied to their racial or ethnic background since the pandemic began. So it is, there's certainly something happening in terms of the increase in anti-Asian hate, and in various cities. And I'm sorry I couldn't. There isn't Atlanta here, but Seattle an increase of 33%, San Francisco an increase of 50%, and San Jose, California an increase of 150%, Los Angeles, where I'm based, an increase of 114%. And on the East Coast, you can see these triple-digit increases. New York City, plus 833%. So certainly, I think there's more anti-Asian hate crimes, and there's 14% of anti-Asian hate incidents that are violent. So we've seen those. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the example of Xiao Zhenxi, who beat her attacker and put him on a stretcher, was quite remarkable. She even ended up raising $1 million for medical costs, which she then donated to fight racism against Asian Americans. So I think it was a happy sort of narrative told from that standpoint. But it's not just violence, right? It's not just people beaten and bloodied. It's all kinds of things that happen around discussions of race. So in March of this year, there were some anti-Asian tweets posted back in 2016 that were surfaced by the former school board vice president of San Francisco Unified School District, Allison Collins. They were written before she was on the school board. The tweets accused Asian Americans of benefiting from the model minority BS and using white supremacist thinking to assimilate and get ahead. She also suggested that Asian Americans were not standing up to President Donald Trump, using a racial slur to describe them. I won't go too deeply into the tweets themselves. I've got them here, but for example, she said, I'm looking to combat anti-Black racism in the Asian community at my daughter's mostly Asian American school. Many Asian students and teachers I know won't engage in critical race conversations unless they see how they are impacted by white supremacy. I grew up in mostly Asian American schools and know this experience all too well. And she goes on from there. But I find it interesting because there is, I think, some aspect of what she says that can't be simply swatted away and denied. I mean, the fact is that the model minority myth has been used to some effect by certain groups that want to promote this image, and it has benefited some Asian Americans to have that image of being successful and adjacent to whites. But it's also, of course, damaging to other groups that aren't doing well. Some more tweets from her involving some of the claims she made that are, I think, poorly worded. But can we have a conversation in which Asian Americans have obviously benefited from their position and are now being heard, and so there's a reaction about it, and is there racism in the Asian American community? Of course there's racism in the Asian American community. There is definitely some anti-Black thinking. There is a need, I think, to address a lot of this. It's really important to have those conversations. So anyways, I'll conclude by sharing another picture that was taken a few years ago, in which the recreation of that famous golden spike image was done with descendants of Chinese laborers, some of whom were descendants of Chinese railroad workers, who then recreated that iconic photo of the anniversary of the first transcontinental railroad's completion at Promontory Summit, Utah. And I'll also share that on a personal level, I mean, I'm elected to my town council the Crescenta Valley Town Council, 6 years now on that council. But I'm not immune to anti-Asian incidents. And on December 1st, 2018, I took my family to the Christmas parade of our town, La Crescenta Montrose. And we parked, saw some teenagers hanging out near the liquor store. But the next day when I looked at my car, there was this written on it. And I have to say I was disturbed by that. I mean, I felt safe in my community, and suddenly somebody had written language that told me I didn't belong, that I shouldn't be there. And so I of course reported it to the sheriff's department, who tagged it as a hate incident, not a hate crime, a hate incident. And I didn't really push hard to get to the bottom of because there was video footage of at the liquor store. They had cameras there, so they apparently did find out. They went and got the footage and so on. But I didn't want to promote a schools to prison pipeline, right? So these kids, they're teenagers. I don't want them to end up in prison because of this. It's not worth it. But to have a talking to perhaps about not doing this kind of thing might be important. And more recently, when I was listening to this podcast that I enjoy, the Risk Show, episode 1103 on perseverance, one of the interesting quotes from the person telling the story that night, or that in the podcast, Saturday Night Live, Chris Redd's father giving him advice to him said, listen, son, you know how hard it is to be a racist. To be a racist, you have to be mad all the time, constantly just mad and ignorant. That takes a lot of work. And then he tells the story of how he was mad with, Chris's mother for 3 hours, and it tired him out. How do you beat a racist? You keep succeeding. While I have to wipe off that Sharpie on the car, because there'd been an incident where the N-word had been written on Chris Redd's car. He can't ever wipe off my success, and he's going to stay mad. So I hope that, success helps to lessen the power of racists over those who would be their victims. And I'll share with you some of my inspirations and hopes here. Certainly from my uncle, who's 84 years old, to do his daily walks unafraid. For my 81-year-old mother-in-law to eat out in peace without, any incident. For my sons, Nathan and Stephen, to be safe wherever they are, whether boogie boarding on the beach, or for my daughters, Caitlin and Jasmine, to grow up being welcomed. That's, I think, the hopes of all parents. And for my wife, Chamnan, and I to grow old together without fear. And actually, Dr. Silvestri, that's on an island near Venice. So perhaps a reminder of where, of your town. But we have to be, I think, allies in a continuum, and to look at what we can do each and every day. So we can be apathetic, where one has no understanding of the issues. You can be aware, so that you have the basic concepts, but not be active on behalf of yourself or others. You can be active, well-informed, sharing and seeking diversity when asked or prompted. Or you can become an advocate, where you're committed, routinely and proactively championing inclusion. And that's the kind of allyship I hope will become part of your lives. It's a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups of people. So thank you, and keep succeeding. Our allyship is needed. And I've got my info here, happy to take questions as they come in.